Somebody tell me why there is a cripple on my firing line. The words landed across the early morning like a thrown stone, sharp and flat and without apology. Gunnery Sergeant Troy Decker had a voice built for ranges, trained to carry over engine noise and wind and the ambient roar of a military installation that never fully slept. He used it now not because he needed to project, but because he wanted the 23 recruits behind him to hear every syllable clearly. He stood at the entrance to the long-range precision course at Camp Pendleton, his tactical vest immaculate. His jaw set with the confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own authority and had no reason to start. The man at the far end of the staging area did not look up. His name was Harold Joseph Merritt, and he was 79 years old. He sat on a concrete equipment block near Lane 7, leaning forward over a walking cane he held with both hands, his large knuckled fingers wrapped around its head with the care of a man who was accustomed to treating the functional things in his life with precision. He wore a faded olive-drab field jacket with the sleeves turned back once, worn brown work pants, and boots that had seen so many miles they had ceased to be any particular color at all. Beside him on the ground, wrapped in an old military surplus blanket secured with 2 canvas straps, was a rifle. The blanket made it impossible to determine what was inside. The length of it suggested something serious. His left leg, when he finally shifted his weight, showed the particular stillness of a limb that had sustained damage significant enough to rewrite the way a man moved through the world. The cane was not decorative. It was structural. It had the worn, darkened grip of something used 10,000 times in 10,000 weathers. His eyes, when they came up, pale blue, the color of high-altitude sky just after dawn, possessing a depth that felt like looking down through clear ice into cold black water, moved across Gunnery Sergeant Decker, with the unhurried calm of a man who had been looked at with contempt before, and had lived the rest of his life comfortably in spite of it. "Sir," said a lance corporal near the roster board, one Corporal Elena Reyes, in a voice carefully designed not to carry further than the sergeant directly above her, "I think he has a reservation." "Long-range lane." "It's been on the books since I did not ask you, Corporal," Decker said, without looking at her. He was walking toward Harold Merritt, already performing for the squad arranged behind him, his stride deliberate, boots clicking the concrete pad with authority. "I asked a general question to a general audience. And the answer is, he doesn't belong here. This is a precision marksmanship assessment for active duty Marines. This is not a senior citizen wellness event. There are ranges for veterans groups on Tuesdays." He stopped 5 feet from Harold. "Tuesdays. Pop, today is Thursday." Harold Merritt looked at him. He did not speak. "I'm going to need you to gather your things," Decker said, louder now, because the squad was watching and the dynamics of the moment required volume to function correctly. "Including whatever you've got in that blanket, which you're going to need to declare if you don't want an additional conversation with the MPs. Civilians don't bring undeclared firearms onto an active base." He crossed his arms. Behind him, 2 of the recruits laughed, a reflexive social laugh, the kind that happens when authority performs and you need to be seen agreeing. "No offense, Grandpa, but you've got the wrong day, the wrong range, and I'd wager pretty heavily the wrong equipment." Harold's first words were quiet enough that the sergeant had to lean forward slightly to hear them. "You haven't seen what's in the blanket yet." Decker straightened. "I don't need to see it. I need you to move." "The wind reads left to right at this time of morning," Harold said, with the same unhurried precision. 22 degrees northeast, variable. There's a cross drift between 350 and 500 meters that'll push you about 3.5 inches at that range. Thermal layer sits about 800 meters up. Changes things at distance. There was a pause. One of the older recruits, a young sergeant named Price, who had been through a precision marksmanship course and understood what he'd just heard, went very still. Decker's jaw tightened. A civilian had just read him the wind on his own range, with the specificity of a man who had been reading ranges like this for a very long time. The anger that came into Decker's expression was not the anger of contempt. It was the anger of a man who has been made to feel uncertain in front of his people. He moved closer. The concrete pad was approximately 40 yards wide at the staging area, flanked by sandbag barriers and equipment caches. The morning air carried cordite and heated metal from the pistol ranges to the west, and, below that, the mineral smell of California scrubland after a night of cold that wasn't quite cold enough. 3 flags on the range poles spoke 3 different angles of the same wind. In the distance, down the long axis of the precision course, the targets were white squares at intervals of 500, 1,000, and further on, nearly invisible in the morning haze, placards at what the range markers indicated as maximum distance. Decker stepped forward and reached down for the blanketed rifle. His hand gripped the canvas strap. That rifle, Harold said quietly, was carried on 4 continents. I'd be careful with the strap. The left buckle has been repaired twice, and I haven't replaced it yet. Decker lifted it anyway. It was heavier than he'd expected. Significantly heavier. He looked at the shape of it through the blanket, recalibrating, and then set it back down, not with reverence, but because the weight had surprised him. He looked at the old man. He was performing, but something in the performance had shifted. He leaned down and pulled the blanket back. The rifle was a custom long-range precision rig built on a Remington 700 action, with a heavy 34-inch barrel that had been rebarreled at least twice. You could see the transition points if you knew where to look. And a scope that was old enough to predate the modern tactical scope market entirely. A custom-ground UNRTL with adjustments worn smooth by decades of use, set in rings that had been fitted and refitted and fitted again until they were as much a part of the rifle as the wood of the stock itself. The stock was dark walnut, not synthetic, worn to a silken finish in every place a hand had ever rested. The rifle was not pristine. It was not new. It was the most completely used object on the range, used in the way that only happens when something has been employed seriously, maintained religiously, and trusted with matters where the margin for error was measured in millimeters and human lives. Sergeant Price, 30 feet away, looked at the scope and his face did something complicated. Decker stood up. He had his theater back now, his certainty reinstalled. A museum piece, he announced, to the squad, to the range, to the morning. A bolt-action antique with optics older than half of you. He tapped the barrel with 2 fingers, a gesture of dismissal, a performance of not being impressed. You came to Camp Pendleton with this, Pops? To shoot against Marines? With this? He tapped the barrel again. And the range dissolved. Not the concrete pad. Not the flags in their sockets and the morning haze and the smell of gun oil. It dissolved fully and completely, replaced by cold and altitude and the smell of thin air and iron and the particular silence that exists above 14,000 feet when there is no wind, because the wind has gone somewhere else for a moment and the world holds its breath. Korea. Not Vietnam. Not the jungle war that had made the era famous. Korea, the forgotten war. The war that began before it ended and never really ended at all. The war where a 22-year-old man named Harold Merritt had been assigned as a scout with the 7th Infantry Division in the final winter of 1952, placed on a ridgeline above the 38th parallel with a rifle that had belonged to his platoon leader, a master sergeant named Victor Cho, who had carried it from the Pusan perimeter to the Chosin Reservoir and back, and who had pressed it into Harold's hands on a hillside in November, with both of them bleeding from a firefight that had cost the platoon 3 men, and who had said, before the evacuation helicopter arrived, "You can see further with this thing than with your eyes. Use that." The target that morning in 1952 was a command post the division had been trying to neutralize for 3 weeks. Conventional suppression fire couldn't reach it without compromising the entire position. Air support had been diverted twice. The request for artillery had been denied for reasons that made political sense to someone far from the mountain. It was Harold and a radio operator named Dupree and the rifle, and a wind that was doing what mountain winds do, arriving from multiple directions simultaneously, changing its mind, lying about its intentions. The distance was contested in the after-action reports. The official figure, later confirmed by survey teams, was 4,830 meters. The conditions that morning included a temperature of 9 degrees Fahrenheit, a crosswind that Harold measured against the movement of frozen grass at 4 elevation intervals, and a light that was the colorless gray of a winter morning with cloud cover that flattened all shadow and made ranging by eye almost impossible. Harold did not have a laser rangefinder. No such thing existed. He had the survey maps, a natural intuition for ground geometry that he had spent 3 years developing, and the rifle that Victor Cho had carried through the worst year of the war. He took 20 minutes to build his firing solution. Dupree lay beside him the entire time without speaking, because Dupree had learned, across 4 months on this hillside, that when Harold went quiet he was working, and that interrupting the work cost time you didn't have. Harold calculated and recalculated and calculated again. He made 4 elevation adjustments with the unertial, tiny, precise clicks in the cold silence of the ridge. He changed his estimate of the wind at distance 3 times based on 3 separate readings from 3 separate reference points. He steadied his breathing. He fired once. The command post radio went silent at 10:47 in the morning. Dupree looked through his spotting scope for a long moment. Then he set the scope down and looked at Harold with the expression of a man who has witnessed something that will stay with him for the rest of his life, regardless of whether he tells anyone about it. "Harold," he said finally, "I don't think I should tell anyone about this." "Probably shouldn't," Harold agreed. He hadn't told anyone about it for 12 years. The record didn't make it into the official logs until a military historian doing a retrospective study on Korean War precision fire tracked it down in Dupree's personal journals in 1964 and got both men to confirm it in separate letters. Dupree did not come home. He had been killed 6 weeks later during a Chinese incursion, and Harold had carried him 2 miles in the dark on a leg that had been fractured by a mortar fragment, and that fracture, improperly set in a field hospital during a resupply shortage that lasted 4 days, had become the structural problem that was still with him 27 years later. The leg. The cane. The way he moved through the world with the slight forward lean of a man compensating for an old correction. The memory vanished as cleanly as it had arrived. The concrete pad solidified. The California morning came back. Gunnery Sergeant Decker's hand was still on the barrel. Harold looked at it. Then he looked at Decker, and his expression had not changed, not tightened, not hardened, not clouded. Simply steady, in the way of a man whose inner weather had long since reached a condition the outer world could not disturb. Corporal Reyes had already moved. She had been moving since the moment Decker touched the rifle, easing backward along the equipment cage, unhurried, toward the duty office at the far end of the staging area. She opened the duty office door with the quietness of someone trying not to announce their intentions, stepped inside, and stood in front of the desk of Master Sergeant Alderon Briggs, who looked up from his scheduling forms and saw her expression. "There's a civilian on lane 7, she said. Gunnery Sergeant Decker is about to pull him off the range. The civilian's name is Harold Merritt." She paused. "I think you should call someone." Master Sergeant Briggs went still, not the still of a man absorbing new information, The still of a man for whom information has just landed with such force that the body needs a moment to redistribute the impact. He looked at her. "Say that name again." She said it again. Briggs stood up. His phone was already in his hand. He found the number from memory, had carried it there for years, the way you carry certain things not because you expect to need them, but because you understand their weight. He dialed. When the line connected, he said, "Colonel, I have a situation at the long-range precision course. I need you to know that Harold Merritt is on the range. And there's a problem." The silence that followed stretched for 5 full seconds. When the colonel's voice returned, it was a different voice entirely. Compressed. Urgent. Every syllable stripped of the comfortable bureaucratic rhythm it wore during the normal business of a base command day. "Where exactly?" "What building?" Briggs told him. "I am leaving now. Get to the base commander. Do not let anyone touch that man. Do not let anyone remove him from that range. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." And Briggs. "The rifle. If anyone has touched the rifle, you get between them and the rifle right now." The call ended. But Briggs had already started a second call, because a name like Harold Merritt did not stop at the colonel. He knew that. He had heard the stories. The colonel would call the general before his car cleared the parking structure. At the base command building, the general's aide walked into a staff meeting without knocking, crossed the room, and placed a folded note beside the general's coffee cup. Major General Sandra Cho, 41 years of service, 2 combat deployments. The daughter of a Korean War veteran who had told her a name once with an expression she had never forgotten. Opened the note, read 3 words, and stood so fast her chair rolled back and struck the credenza behind her. Her aide was already outside with the car running. In the motor pool, the duty officer received a call he had never received before, and would spend the rest of his career describing. A direct command to dispatch a convoy to the precision range. No delay. Maximum urgency. No questions. On range 7, Decker was still performing. He had moved past the rifle and was now addressing the squad, building his case to the assembled audience of 23 recruits who were watching with the focused attention of young people trying to figure out what the correct response was. He was talking about range protocols. He was talking about base security. He was talking about the difference between veterans programs and active duty training facilities and why the distinction mattered. He was good at this. He had the voice, the bearing, the institutional weight. The recruits were nodding. Harold Merritt was not listening. Harold Merritt was reading the flags. He was sitting in the same position he had occupied since he arrived, both hands on his cane, his pale eyes moving with the quiet, methodical rhythm of a man running calculations. Flag 1, Flag 2, the grass on the berm at 300 meters, the shimmer off the metal target housing at 500, and then the long look down the axis of the range to where the maximum distance target sat almost at the limit of unaided vision. A white square at the end of a corridor of air that held within it multiple wind layers, a thermal inversion and a light that was changing as the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline and began to flatten. He was building a firing solution. He had been building it since he sat down. The sound came from the direction of the main access road, a single siren first, low and official, growing, then a second. Then, underneath both, the heavy synchronized rumble of large engines moving with purpose. Decker stopped mid-sentence. The recruits turned. The sound built until it was no longer a background presence, but the primary fact of the morning, filling the range with the specific register of institutional mobilization. 2 military police cruisers arrived first, pulling up to the range entrance with the practiced speed of official urgency. Behind them, a command Humvee. Behind that, a second Humvee with a pennant on the antenna that made Decker go very still. Behind that, a staff car whose plates, when Corporal Reyes later described them, caused a recruit to say he had never seen plates like those on this base before. Doors opened. Officers moved. They moved with the precise economy of people who had been told something important and had organized themselves around that importance. The colonel was first through the range gate, his eyes sweeping the staging area and finding Harold Merritt in under 2 seconds. Behind him came 2 other officers and the command sergeant major, and then, after the staff car, unhurried but absolute in her authority, Major General Sandra Cho, who walked onto the concrete pad without looking at anything except the old man with the cane on the equipment block near Lane 7. Gunnery Sergeant Decker turned to face the convoy. His face had gone the color of range chalk. The general reached Harold Merritt. She stopped. For a long moment she looked at him, at the faded olive jacket, the worn boots, the hands on the cane, the pale eyes that had come up to meet hers without surprise or relief or ceremony. She looked at the rifle in its blanket on the ground beside him. Then she raised her hand to the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that anyone on that range had ever seen. Every officer behind her followed simultaneously, a wall of salutes directed at a disabled veteran in civilian clothes sitting on a concrete equipment block with a walking cane. The sound from 23 recruits was not a word. It was a breath, collective, involuntary, the physical expression of 23 individual certainties being revised at once. Gunnery Sergeant Troy Decker's arms went slowly to his sides. His jaw worked. He was not a stupid man. He was a blind one. He was beginning to see. Major General Cho lowered her salute and turned to the assembled range. "My name is Major General Sandra Cho, Commanding Officer, Camp Pendleton. The man you see before you is Harold Joseph Merritt, Sergeant First Class, United States Army, 7th Infantry Division, Korea, 1951 to 1953. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Awarded the Silver Star. The Bronze Star with 2 oak leaf clusters. The Purple Heart with cluster. Commended individually by the Commanding General of the 7th Infantry Division. She paused, and holder of the confirmed long-range precision fire record for United States military history, 4,830 meters. A single shot. Bolt-action rifle, iron sights, and an Unerteel scope. December 1952. Confirmed by survey, confirmed by witness, confirmed by Army Historical Center review in 1964. Not broken since. She looked at the rifle on the ground. With that rifle, no one spoke. The walking cane Gunnery Sergeant Decker described as proof of this man's disability. He acquired it carrying a mortally wounded soldier 2 miles through enemy-controlled terrain on a fractured leg in 1952. The fracture was caused by the same mortar round that killed 3 other men in his unit. The leg healed improperly. He walked on it anyway. She looked at Decker. Her voice remained absolutely level. Gunnery Sergeant Decker. You will report to my office at 1300 hours. You will bring a full written account of this morning's events. A formal review will be conducted by your chain of command, and the outcome of that review will be determined by your commanding officer in consultation with my office. You are restricted from range officer duties pending that review. She turned away from him. The military police officers had moved to positions beside Decker without ceremony, presence enough. Then Harold Merritt stood up. He rose from the equipment block slowly, with the particular care of a man who had learned over decades to take rising seriously. He took the cane in his left hand, steadied himself, and walked to where Decker stood. His steps were uneven, the compensation, the lean, the cane marking every other step. He stopped in front of the younger man and placed his right hand gently on Decker's shoulder. The same shoulder Decker had loomed over 40 minutes ago. The inversion was witnessed by everyone. "You've got fire," Harold said. His voice was the low rumble of a man economizing words across a lifetime. "Don't let anybody take that from you. But fire without patience is just burning." He let his hand rest for a moment. "The shot you couldn't make today wasn't a question of equipment or ability. It was a question of time. You need to be willing to sit with the wind long enough to understand it. Most people aren't willing to wait that long. That's the only difference." He picked up his rifle in its blanket. He walked to lane 7. He set the blanket down with the care of a man setting down something that has earned its care, unwrapped it, and settled into a prone position with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been getting down and getting up from the earth for 60 years. His bad leg straightened to the side. His hands found the rifle. His eye found the scope. The range went absolutely silent. He took 8 minutes. No one spoke for 8 minutes. He read the flags. He watched the grass at the berm. He did something with his left hand against the morning air that Sergeant Price later described as feeling the wind against his skin and doing arithmetic. He made 3 adjustments to the scope with the tips of 2 fingers. Tiny movements, each click distinct in the silence. He settled. He breathed twice. Slowly, the 3rd exhale came out and did not come back in. The rifle spoke once. A single shot so precise and contained that it sounded less like a firearm than like a door closing in a very quiet house. Down the range, at maximum distance, the target's center marker registered a hit. The range instruments confirmed 4,912 meters. No one had ever shot this range to maximum distance before. The maximum distance markers were there for measurement purposes. No one had ever touched them. Major General Cho looked down the range for a long moment. Then she turned to her aide and said something no one else heard. Her aide wrote it down. Harold packed the rifle back into its blanket with the same care he had unpacked it, rose from the prone with the same deliberate process, took up his cane, and walked to the staging area exit. The recruits parted for him without being asked. He walked through them and toward the parking area where his truck waited, a battered Ford with a sun-faded hood and a bumper sticker so old the words had bleached to almost nothing. Sergeant Price was still staring down the range. 8 weeks later, in a strip mall diner 3 miles from the base, Gunnery Sergeant Troy Decker came in on a Saturday morning. He was not in uniform. He had lost something in his posture that he had carried so long he had not known it was separate from him until it was gone. He was smaller. He moved more carefully. He looked, Corporal Reyes later said, like a man who had been carrying his confidence like a weapon and had recently learned it was the wrong tool for most situations. Harold was in a corner booth with eggs and coffee and the morning paper folded to the crossword. He had completed 2/3 of it. When he saw Decker, he set down the pen. He did not stand. Decker stopped at the booth. "Mr. Merritt," he said, "I owe you an apology. What I said, how I acted, I didn't see you. I saw a cane and I made a decision that had nothing to do with the man holding it. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Harold looked at him for the length of a full breath. Then he slid the coffee menu across the table and moved the folded newspaper to the window side. "Sit down," he said. They poured decent coffee. Decker sat. For a while, neither of them spoke. The diner moved around them with its Saturday morning commerce, plates and steam and the low conversation of people who had nowhere to be urgently. Harold returned to his crossword. Decker held his coffee with both hands. After a while, Harold said, without looking up from the paper, 7 letters. Patience in waiting. Enns and E. Decker thought about it for a moment. Silence? He tried. Harold looked up. He considered this. Not wrong, he said. and wrote something in the margin. They sat a while longer. Outside, the California morning was doing what California mornings do, burning off the haze in slow certainty, the light coming through the window in measured degrees, patient, inevitable, taking all the time it needed to become fully itself. When Harold finally left, he rose from the booth with the familiar lean and the cane and the boots that had no particular color anymore. And he walked out into the light with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had been somewhere real, and come back and found that the ordinary world was plenty large enough to hold everything that mattered. Decker watched him cross the parking lot. He thought about patience, about sitting with the wind long enough to understand it, about the distance between what a man looked like and what a man had done with his time on Earth. There are men who carry histories in their bones that we cannot read from the outside. Men who have done things the instruments were not sophisticated enough to measure and the records were not attentive enough to capture. They sit in diners with crosswords. They move through parking lots with canes. They hold rifles that look like antiques to people who have not yet learned the only thing that actually matters about any instrument, what it has done, and in whose hands, and at what cost, and why. If you were moved by Harold's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.